caring for the elderly. As adult children, as well as local church leaders, we are to make sure that elderly people are cared for properly. Here's Gene.
It's interesting that here in Psalm 71, David is talking about old age. This gets a little personal for some of us. It's kind of nice to know the truth that is in this psalm, particularly as we grow older. Now, we're not sure how old David was actually when he penned this particular psalm. But we do know that he penned it, and he began it with a prayer. And this is what he said: Lord, I seek refuge in you. Let me never be disgraced. In your justice, rescue and deliver me. Listen closely to me and save me. And as you go on in the psalm, you realize that he's talking about old age, his old age. And he's sharing very realistically how he feels about the fact that he's getting older. And one of the things that he shares very openly is fear of abandonment in old age, which indeed is certainly something that we all experience as we're getting older. In Psalm 71, verse 9, don't discard me in my old age. As my strength fails, do not abandon me. And certainly those are temptations for all of us as we grow older, as we begin to lose control of our physical body, as we begin to weaken, as our minds begin to fail in terms of old age and not as sharp as they used to be, which is predictable. We know that to be true. And I can't help but think of my own mother, who was very active up until she was 98 when she passed into the presence of the Lord. But I remember there were times, probably in the late 80s or early 90s, I was having a conversation with her, and she was really very disturbed with me and with my brothers and sisters, because she was absolutely sure, and she wasn't paranoid, this was just what she was thinking, she was absolutely sure that we had told the officials where she could renew her driver's license not to renew her driver's license because we didn't want her out on the road. Now, she was used to being on her own, driving, traveling, doing a lot of things, and when they said, we're not going to renew your driver's license, Mrs. Getz, she just was sure that we put them up to it. And I reassured her. I think she finally believed me that we didn't do that. The fact of the matter is she had a minor accident as she used to drive around town. She sideswiped some car, and that probably went on her record, and they looked at her age and looked at her record and said, Mrs. Getz, we're not going to renew your driver's license. Well, that was rather disturbing because it restricted her, and she just didn't like the fact that she was told that she was growing older and she was not trustworthy on the road. I remember another time I was talking to her, and she said, Gene, I'm losing my mind. And I know that she was in her 90s, and I said, what do you mean, Mom, you're losing your mind? She said, well, I can't recall all of the children's and grandchildren's birthdays without a record. And the fact of the matter is that she remembered all of the children and grandchildren's birthdays very regularly without a record. And I said, Mom, I can't even remember my own with a record. You're not losing your mind. You're just going through this phase in terms of getting older. Another time she was complaining about the fact that her shoulder was bothering her when she lifted her arm. And she was in her 90s, and I said, Mom, you've worked on the farm all these years. You've worn out your rotator cuff. And that's why you have a hard time lifting your arm. And so as I was reflecting on this, I was reflecting on old age very personally as I saw this happening in my mom. And David's feeling some of the same things. Now, probably he's thinking of that in terms of a much broader perspective, in terms of the way in which God had been with him in battle and had led him. And so he's fearful of abandonment. Later on he says, and this is sort of a summary, even when I'm old and gray, God, do not abandon me. And it's reassuring that God reassures him and all of us that God cares about us, no matter what our age. But the fact is that he puts responsibility on others to look after people when they get older, and God spoke very specifically through the Apostle Paul in relationship to a very specific group of people who were in need in the church. And I'm referring specifically to what he wrote to Timothy in the first letter there in chapter 5, verse 4, when he very specifically spoke about widows. And I think we need to understand that there's some cultural dimensions here, because there were a lot of widows in the New Testament setting. And one of the reasons, at least in my research, I've discovered that there were a lot of widows is because a lot of these women lost their husbands in the Roman wars. And so there was an unusual number of widows. And so Paul addresses this when he says, but if any widow has children or grandchildren, they must learn to practice godliness towards their own family first and to repay their parents, for this pleases God. And later he got very direct when he says in verse 8, but if anyone does not provide for his own, that is his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. In essence, what Paul is saying, we would expect this from pagans, to not care for their parents who are getting older. Or we would expect this from very carnal, religious people, even like the Pharisees, that Jesus spoke to and called them hypocrites because they had this concept called Corban, which simply meant if indeed they dedicated their money to the temple, but at the same time had access to it themselves, then they had no responsibility to their parents, which was a total hypocritical, selfish maneuver to get away from this responsibility. So Paul is saying we expect that from pagans or carnal unbelievers who even claim to be religious, but not from believers. Now, it's really interesting that as you go on in this passage, there's a principle really that emerges. And when you look at your Life Essentials Bible and you go to 1 Timothy chapter 5, you'll see this principle number 11 that grows out of this passage, which I've entitled Material Needs. When there are legitimate material needs among believers that cannot be met by family members, as a church, we are to assist in meeting these needs. Now notice this principle says legitimate material needs, because Paul addresses that very, very significantly in the passage. Because what he is saying, there has to be a legitimate need, because people do take advantage of others. And we know that to be true, and so we have to be in guard in relationship to being responsible not to enable people and allow them to take advantage of a situation. Now, here we have a reflection and response question that relates to these cultural dynamics, which the psalmist is addressing, as well as Paul in the New Testament. So here's the question. What are some of the variables in our own culture that affect the way elderly people can be cared for, especially financially? And here is where we see the variation in culture. In the New Testament world, remember the widows that were being neglected in the daily distribution of food. They were the Grecian widows. It wasn't a matter that there wasn't money in the coffers in Jerusalem. They had coffers to take care of people who were in need. They had plenty of money. But when people became believers, they were cut off from the welfare system in Judaism. They no longer had access to what normally Jews had in their system. So here are believers without access when they were truly in need. And that was a very unusual situation which, of course, the church took care of. We see the same thing when they had a famine that affected Jerusalem and Judea. And the Antioch believers sent money to care for the Jews in Jerusalem who were believers. It wasn't a matter that there wasn't money in the coffers. Even during the famine, as far as the Jews were concerned in the temple, it was a matter that Christians no longer had access to it. And that, of course, broadened the need. So the church stepped in and was responsible. Now, today we have a lot of variation as far as different cultural situations. Today we have insurance programs that are universal within our own culture. We have Social Security. We have other government assistance in times of special needs among both young and old. But even with that, in my ministry over the years, I've discovered that there are Christians because of crises, particularly Christians, but not just Christians, but others even outside the church who have real needs. And we need to be generous in helping to meet those needs. But in doing so, we had to set up some very specific guidelines in terms of distributing the funds that Christians give to care for those who are in need. Because once people find out, even outside the church, particularly outside the church, you're a generous church, they'll knock on your door every day trying to get handouts. And they've become very, very astute at being able to do that. And one of the things that we have always done, principle guideline number 1, is this principle from 1 Timothy, and that is to have them fill out a form and tell us all about their family background, their father, their mother, and or their children if they're older. And we'll ask very specific questions. Are your parents or your children, in this case, able to help you? And it's amazing how many times you find people say, well, I wouldn't want to approach my parents. We've had to say, well, if you won't, we will. And we find out that parents want to know the need. Sadly, sometimes we find out parents don't care. Or children don't care about their parents. And that's sad. But that creates a real need. But we have to be able to discern what that real need is. And of course, I believe this principle deals with more than just the financial needs. It deals with emotional needs. And I think one of the saddest things that happens in our culture is when children, growing children, put their children or their parents into nursing homes and never show up, never follow up, never communicate. Or if they do, very seldom. I've seen that. And to me, what a tragedy. What a violation of this principle that David addressed from his own life, but that Paul addressed for us. So here's the principle to live by. As adult children, as well as local church leaders, we're to make sure that elderly people are cared for properly.